The nation of Zimbabwe was once one of the most prosperous countries in Africa, but over the last 10 years, its economy collapsed and Zimbabwe turned into one of the most destitute countries in the world. 3 years ago, the inflation rate there reached 500 billion%. The country defaulted on its foreign debt, unemployment shot up to 80%, and the ensuing humanitarian crisis resulted in millions of Zimbabweans fleeing the country. Many place the blame on President Robert Mugabe, who's held power in Zimbabwe since the country's independence from Britain 31 years ago. Mugabe is now 87 years old and widely regarded as a despot, but when he came to power, he was viewed as a savior. In the late 1970s, Robert Mugabe was a leading figure in the civil war that ended white minority rule in the country then known as Rhodesia. Hailed as a war hero, Mugabe was elected Prime Minister of the newly renamed Zimbabwe in 1980 and almost immediately began exerting absolute and brutal control over the country. He is said to have ordered the torture and mass killings of opposition forces. Mugabe consolidated his power by doing away with the position of Prime Minister and being elected President. He won the subsequent 3 presidential races amid accusations of voter fraud and intimidation. Zimbabwe's economic downfall is generally traced to the year 2000, when Mugabe began confiscating farmlands owned mostly by white farmers, a campaign that at times became violent. It resulted in international condemnation and the beginning of wide-scale sanctions against the Mugabe government. In 2005, Mugabe launched another controversial operation to clear slum areas. That resulted in 700,000 citizens being displaced. By 2006, the Zimbabwe economy experienced a hyperinflation that resulted in its currency becoming worthless. Most of the country's population became unemployed, store shelves went empty. Around 3.5 million Zimbabweans, 1/4 of the country, fled, most of them spilling into neighboring South Africa, where they were promptly returned to their country. It is widely believed that Robert Mugabe lost the 2008 presidential election, where a recount took place behind closed doors. But he refused to give up power. He did eventually agree to a power-sharing deal and reinstated the post of Prime Minister. And that Prime Minister is Morgan Tsvangirai, who joins us now. Mr. Prime Minister, welcome to Chicago tonight.
Nice
to have you here.
Thank you very much.
For the folks that don't know you, and I would imagine that it's a lot of people, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, thank you, Eddie. I was born in 1952 in a rural area there in Boera in Zimbabwe. I went to school up to college and started my working life as a textile worker and then as a miner for 10 years. Then joined the trade union movement as a full-time official. I've been Secretary General of the National Confederation for almost 10 years. Started the movement for democratic change 10 years ago, and Prime Minister of Zimbabwe now.
And Movement for Democratic Change is the party to which you belong, which is the opposition party to that of Robert Mugabe, isn't it?
It was opposition until 2008 when we won the parliamentary majority, so we are no longer opposition.
And become a coalition government.
Yes.
There was a time at the beginning of the present Zimbabwe that you supported President Robert Mugabe, isn't that right?
That's right. In 1980, when Mugabe came from the Liberation War, when it was concluded and we had our independence, Mugabe was the hero of everyone. And I strongly supported him because he had brought independence. And I think that was a very important step in our lives.
And when do you feel that things changed, in your view?
I think things started changing around the late 90s, early 90s.
Was there one particular incident or a series of incidents?
I think it was a cumulative. There was a structural adjustment introduced in the country. I was in the trade union movement and I objected to it.
Describe to us what that is.
Structural adjustment is a policy of austerity measures because the economy had run out of resources. So the IMF imposed these austerity measures, just like is happening in Greece now. And of course, we resisted as a trade union movement. We put forward to government counter proposals. Mugabe would not listen. He would not negotiate, and eventually he would not even listen to what we were saying.
And that's when you rose to the power of leading a political party against President Mugabe?
That's when, of course, together with the workers and other social movements in the country, we saw the crisis deepening, and we said that this was a crisis of governance and a crisis of leadership, and that there was need to create an alternative political movement of the people.
And so you created that movement, but over the last 10 years, you personally and the party have faced, along with the country, have faced a number of setbacks. Tell us a little bit about the issues and the problems that you've faced personally with the Mugabe government.
First of all, at a personal level, I've suffered personal hurt. I've been imprisoned, I've been brutalized, I've been persecuted. But the generality of the population suffered even more. They were persecuted even to the extent of killings taking place. They were traumatized. There was a selective application of the law. Our people became the target of national institutions like the intelligence, police, and army. And literally, the population became captive to Mugabe's one-man rule. Eventually, there was no space for anyone, whether it is political parties, whether it's trade unions, whether it is civic society. And we felt that we were being suffocated by a country, by a party that we supported for our liberation, and a man we held in high esteem. We had now become the oppressor of the people. So eventually discussions and dialogue amongst the social movements firstly campaigned for a new constitution, then from the new constitution we campaigned for an alternative movement, and that's how we came to be.
One of the times that when you were imprisoned, you were calling for the removal of President Mugabe, preferably through elections, but you said if he doesn't go, he must go violently, or words to that effect, and you were jailed for treason. Yeah. Were you calling for his assassination?
No. There were two incidences. Firstly, there was that statement that if you don't go peacefully, you will go violently. It was a prediction. It was not a statement of intent. Neither was it a policy of the Movement for Democracy to engage in violent means. So it was just mistaken, and it was a gaffe, a political gaffe.
But that was a pretty big gaffe.
Yes, but I was not prosecuted for that. The one that you are making reference is where we had involvement, this Canadian firm with Ari Ben Menashe, where there was supposedly a discussion about assassinating Mugabe. But the court said no, there was no evidence of that. Again, it was a misjudgment in engaging and discussing with those people who had ill intentions. But at the end, I was acquitted on those charges. That was the time when I was incarcerated.
And then came the elections in 2008, which you feel that you won, or at least your party won. Is that correct?
Yes, we won that election. Mugabe does not dispute that. He said we won the election, but he did not have sufficient votes to surpass the 51%. But I had won 47.9 against his 40%.
And at one point you pulled out saying that it wasn't going to be a fair election. Isn't that correct?
Yes, what then happened was that when those announcements, after 5 weeks, when it was announced that I had won by 47.9 and he had lost by 40%, there was then a runoff. We were supposed to go to a second runoff, myself and Mugabe. And at that time, the army came in and started violent campaign against our supporters throughout the country. I couldn't move, and no one could campaign on my behalf. So I decided, you know, what's the use? What's the use of going into an election which is already predetermined? So I decided it's better to protect the people than to go on that.
Then why did you agree to be part of a coalition government as Prime Minister?
Well, there were a number of developments. Firstly, there was a very big pressure from the Southern Africa Development Community leaders and the AU leaders that there was need they didn't recognize the runoff. Of course, Mugabe ran a one-man race and said, I have won, but of course no one recognized him. That was one. Secondly, the Southern Africa Development SADC leaders said that and persistently pressured us into a compromise. And that compromise was a power-sharing agreement that is now considered as an inclusive government.